Welcome back to another video with Average Guy's Garage. This is part 8 and we're going to start reassembling the engine components that we took off. The fuel rail, the input, the throttle, these hoses. Get the radiator back in, the starter back in, thermostat cover back in. We're going to have to buy a new gasket for the input manifold. So the first thing I'm going to do is connect this line back to this bracket right here that's on the support. Then we'll hook up the throttle, not the throttle, but the shifter linkage.
Okay.
This is a 10mm wrench to tighten up this air conditioning hose here. Has a little bracket on there a little mount, shock mount. Alright, so this replacement transmission came with the bracket for the shifter. So this part of the bracket right here is this same part right here. This piece has to go down like this. I'll take these two bolts out right here from this bracket, take it out, just put the new bracket back in place. Make sure that when this link goes back to the bracket, that it says the dipstick tube is on the driver's side of this cable. Otherwise the bracket, it hits on this side and you can't get the bracket to line up, so this has to come down on the passenger side of the dipstick tube for the transmission. The shifter linkage is now hooked back up. There's a bolt that comes through and then a nut goes on the end, 12mm, and there's a cotter pin here in the back, and you can turn the bolt that's in there because it has to line up with a couple flanges for it to go into the slot here. Let me show you the slot. It has to go into that slot lined up perfectly so it will tighten down. The next thing I'm going to do is put the starter back in. So this is the original Toyota OEM starter that came with the car. It must hold up pretty well. I think this was a 14mm bolt. We'll check that in a minute. So there's one bolt that goes in this way, and there's another bolt that's going to go in here on the bottom going this way into the transmission bell housing. Yes, this is a 14mm. Get this in by hand and then tighten it down with the socket, with the wrench. Okay. All right, starter is in place. All right. Next is I'm going to put the thermostat housing back on so I can get the alternator back on. So this thermostat housing is held on by two, I think 10mm bolts here. I didn't notice. Oh, there's a O-ring here. I was wondering why there was no gasket for this thermostat housing, but it doesn't need one with that O-ring. I'll put this on. This will be behind the thermostat. I mean, behind the alternator, so it's a good idea to. I mean, you have to put it on first. If you ever have to change your thermostat, I think you'd have to take the alternator off to do it. Alright, let me see if that's a 10mm. Yes, and these thermostat housings are notoriously brittle, so be careful tightening it down. Use the same pressure as you go down, and then don't over tighten it. If you crack your thermostat housing, you got to go buy another one. They won't break the bank, but it'll be a trip to the parts store you don't have to make. Okay, good there. Good there. Okay, and this goes down to the lower radiator. Next I put in the alternator. The alternator has two bolts. One right here is a long bolt. The other one is a short bolt. This alternator actually will pivot on this short bolt, on the long bolt right here. So if you take out this top one here, you can actually pivot your alternator away, which probably might give you access to this thermostat housing. I said before that you might have to take the alternator off to work on that, but probably still a good practice. So let's put this on. First we'll fit this on the pivot point. And I'm going to put the upper bolt in, which should give me the right placement for the lower. Okay, so I've loosened this a little bit more to give me some room to maneuver that back down. It wasn't fitting on the pivot area very nicely. So I think I'm going to take this bolt out and then put the pivot in first. Getting this lined up with the hole here, it's off by about 1/2 inch. I've got to work that over. I think I'll take it. I need to get under here and lift it up a little bit. I have to get a longer wrench to lift it a little bit. So I was able to maneuver it and put the bolt in until I could feel it was close, and then after it got pretty close, and I started the bolt. Okay, I believe this is a 14 millimeter. Right before I tighten that down, I want to get this second one in place here. Alright, so they're both in place. This one was a 12 millimeter on top. Okay. All right, done. Dinner bell. Now we're going to start hooking up some of these electrical connectors to the alternator and to the starter. We also have a plug that goes in here. Like I say, we have to figure out where all this stuff goes again. I think what I'm going to do is move this out of the way, put that exhaust manifold back on in a second. I'm sorry, the intake manifold back on. And then that should help me start sorting out these wires and cables again. I'm moving to the back now of the engine to reattach the 5 bolts that hold on the exhaust manifold. There's 3 on the bottom and then 2 on the top. There's 1 here, 1 there, 3 on the bottom, 12 millimeter. Then I'll put this heat shield back on right here. Keep moving forward. The exhaust manifold is now tightened down, and we're going to work the heat shield down on top of it. This has 6 bolts. Heat shield is on, all 6 bolts. We're able to get back in place okay. There's 1 down there. Those are kind of tough to get, but little bumps and scratches on the knuckles and you can get it in there. Okay, now I have hooked up this module here. I'm not sure what it is exactly. It has one cable going to the dash, which might be the speedo, or maybe the speedo, and then it's got this other one that goes down and goes to the throttle. So I'm not sure exactly, but it has one electrical connector here, and then there was another electrical connector here that comes off of it and goes here to this. So I'm not sure what this particular section of the does for the car, but hook that back up. I've now connected the coil. It has a rail, and there's 2 bolts with 2 10mm nuts holding that on. Connected the electrical connections here. Next, I'm going to put the intake manifold back on. There's 2 bolts bottom right when looking from the front, and 3 studs with nuts on this side. I've also purchased a new gasket. That's right here. And we'll get this on. I'm going to clean up the surface on the engine and on the intake manifold as well. Alright, so I've been cleaning the surfaces here so I can get the new gasket, the seat, as cleanly as possible. It doesn't take any gasket material, only the gasket itself. So I've done this part here now, and I've already been over here working on this for a little bit, and so that's pretty clean now. So I can just take these bolts and nuts off and put the new gasket on. Alright, there we go. This bracket here is going to go back in with this bolt. That holds the water, one of the water hoses. When you're tightening the bolts to the intake manifold or intake plenum, make sure you tighten them equally as you cinch it down. Don't do one corner all the way, because what you want to do is you don't want to break it. It's made out of aluminum, so you want to do even pressure all the way around, just a little bit as it goes on. Once it's seated firm, then you can tighten it down. Okay. Alright, so now I'm going to go ahead and tighten it up here. Alright, the intake manifold is back on. I'm hooking up the fuel rail now with the fuel injectors, and I had to remove the coil rail because it turns out the fuel rail goes behind the cabling for the coil rail, and it wasn't fitting. Plus there is a bracket right here that holds the fuel rail in place. So it's a matter of, you have to line up the injectors, get them seated, and then we can put that bolt on the fuel rail and then put this other rail back on. Fuel rail is now seated, and I'm just tightening up these bolts that hold it in place. Once they're all lined up, you can press them down. They have little O-rings that seat them. I believe this is 14mm bolt here. Alright, that's going to be it for today. We've got the intake button down with the new gasket. The coil rail is on, the fuel rail is on. We're getting more detangled from these cables. Somewhere I misplaced the bolt right here that goes to the starter, so I'm going to have to get that replacement bolt. Things are becoming a little more clear. I do need to probably take this fuel rail off again, because this bracket right here needs to go on here, and it has to go behind this bar, and it's not going to fit. It won't go over, it has to go behind, so I'll have to remove that fuel rail one more time and get that back together.